Hi, my video today is about how to max out your gear without breaking anything. There's nothing worse than fishing than losing a big fish. It's a soul-destroying moment for a lot of people that only fishermen really understand, to be honest. So what I want to talk about today are the techniques that you can employ and how you set up your gear and how you fight fish to land more fish and lose less. There's 4 areas I need to cover. The first one is the 30% rule and how to break it. The second one is 100% knots and why they're really important. Thirdly, we need to talk about the rod and reel ratings. And fourthly, we need to talk about fighting techniques. So I'm not just talking about holding onto the reel, pointing the rod and saying a prayer. There's some things you need to understand to do this safely and successfully. This video is a little bit long and a bit technical, I'm afraid, so please stay with me. First of all, the 30% rule. What is the 30% rule? Well, the 30% rule is a guide that fishing rod and reel manufacturers often use when it comes to rating their gear. It means the rod or reel drag rating is about 30% of the line you are using, or you could say a third, divide by 3, just for simplicity's sake. So if you're using 6 kilo line matched to a rod and reel rated for 6 kilo line, the rod will be designed to handle 2 kilos of pressure or force applied through the line, and the reel will be able to output at least 2 kilos of smooth drag without it shuddering or being strained. So this principle is the same pretty much across the board. So if we're looking at a game fishing setup like this one here, this is a setup for 37 kilo line. Doing the math, 30% or a third of 37 kilo comes out to about 12 or 13 kilos of drag. So I set the reel at strike to 12 or 13 kilos, and then I can leave it and it's set up for fighting game fish basically. This is an Akuma Makaira, it's a 50 wide, it can output 27 kilos of drag. So I could fish 24 kilo, 37 kilo, or potentially even 60 kilo line because its drag is capable of handling those different line ratings. Another example, what if we had, say, a PE6 stickbait rod? If the PE6 line was rated for 60 pounds, then you divide it by 3, you get about 20 pounds or 9 kilos of drag that you could put through that outfit successfully without straining or breaking anything. So why does the industry use the 30% rule? Why not a 50% rule? Why not use 3 kilos of drag if you're fishing 6 kilo line, for example? Well, the truth is, in the real world of fishing, there's so many variables that can weaken your line and cause it to break or break your gear. So 30% gives you a very good margin of error. Here's some factors you need to understand. As soon as you tie a knot in the line, you create a weak point. Common knots like the clinch knot, the uni knot, the spider hitch. There's been different tests done, but they tend to break about 80–90% of the line's original strength. It can change, I've seen different tests, but that's about the ballpark figure. I find with these knots also over the course of a day's fishing, they tend to get weaker as well over time. Another reason for the 30% rule. Over the course of a fishing trip or a day, there'll be wear and tear. And so fishing line will often get rubbed against the boat, might get tangled, get kinked, sometimes you stand on it by accident. Fish hits it, all kinds of reasons why. Sometimes you don't notice what's happened, but you've probably experienced that situation where you've hooked a good fish, it's taken off and then suddenly the line's gone slack. And you know the line should have held, but somewhere along the way, maybe it was a bad knot, or maybe there was damage to the line that you didn't notice, but it snapped anyway. So you need that margin of error. Another reason for the 30% rule. If you're fighting a particularly big or powerful fish and it accelerates very quickly, or it changes direction, or it shakes its head violently, that can cause a sudden shock, which can cause the line to snap. So you need that margin of error. For fishermen who are using braid, this is also really relevant. For monofilament, you've got a little bit of shock absorption, it'll stretch a bit when you're fighting a big fish. However, with braid, you don't have that advantage. For game fishermen, there's another really important reason why I use the 30% rule. If you're using 24 kilo line, for example, and you hooked a marlin and there's 2, 3, 4, 500 meters of line in the water, and the fish changes direction, it'll cause a big belly in the line. The pressure starts to really build up while the water's in the line. It may be at 8 kilos of force at the rod tip, but in the water it could be 10 or 12 kilos. And so using the 30% rule helps, again, introduce a margin of error. So there's a number of reasons why the 30% rule exists. But if you know why it exists, then you can also find the ways to break the rule without breaking your line or breaking your gear. This is how you push your gear to the max to be able to land those big fish. First of all, learn how to tie 100% knots. What does that mean? Tie knots that will retain almost close to or 100% of the line's rating. There's a lot of knots that will get close, but if you can learn how to tie the really good knots, then you can have extra confidence in your gear when you push it really hard. For monofilament, if I'm tying a knot in my main line, I usually use the Bimini twist. The Bimini twist is a little bit fiddly to tie, but once you get it down, it's a fantastic knot and will retain close to 100% of the breaking strain of the line you're using. For braid, it's really important to learn how to tie knots that will retain, again, close to 100% of the line's rating. For example, the PR bobbin knot, really fantastic knot. It's fiddly, difficult to learn. Once you got it down, really good. I find for stick baiting gear, jigging gear, I'll tie a PR bobbin knot, but for soft baiting, I tend to use a 12-turn Bimini knot. This holds really, really well, and it's quick and easy to use. One note about braid. Braid is worse than mono when it comes to tying a knot in it. As soon as you tie a knot in braid, it gets weakened very, very quickly. But a lot of braid tends to over-test. So for example, if I've bought 6 kilo braid in a proper destruction test, it'll probably break at about 10 kilos. So if you tie a knot in it, and even if the knot is 70% of 10 kilo, then it's still going to break around the 6 kilo mark. So it's still a strong knot. So let's talk about fishing gear. It's pretty much the same principle across the board. I'm going to use a little straight line outfit here just to illustrate. So we've got a Daiwa SLX20 reel loaded with 6 kilo line, and that's matched with a Daiwa Saltist rod, and the rod is rated for 6 to 10 kilo line. So theoretically, if I set the drag on my reel to about 2 kilos, that's about 30% of 6 kilo line. That's the standard rating for this outfit. However, if I tie my knots really well, and I'm using a rod with a slightly higher rating, I can actually push that to about 4 kilos. So effectively, I've doubled the amount of force or pressure I can apply to the fish that I'm playing with this outfit. So if you are going to fish like this, one really important consideration, you have to use a rod that has a higher rating. That's why I bought this rod. It's rated for 6 to 10 kilo line. If you use the 30% rule on 10 kilo line, it's about 3.5 kilos of drag. I'm pushing it closer to 4, so the rod can actually handle it. If, for example, you're going to use 10 kilo line, buy a rod that's rated for 10 to 15 kilo line, because you are going to push it harder. And that way you won't break the rod, and you'll stay within the limits of the rod's manufacturer's ratings as well. I'll just quickly mention one little caveat here. If you've purchased a really high quality fishing rod, manufacturers tend to build in a bit of extra strength in their rods. For example, Sinnett. I've got a really nice Van Diemen GT stickbait rod rated for PE 5 to 8 line. Its max drag rating is 14 kilos, so it's rated from 6 to 14 kilos. Speaking to Graham at Sinnett, I know he's tested it over 18 kilos. He hasn't given me permission to fish it that high, but he's built in an extra margin of safety. And so when you're fishing with high quality fishing rods, you can often push it a bit further. Now just be really careful, because if you're pushing it further than what it's rated for, then most often rod manufacturers won't honour the guarantee if you do manage to break it. But it's something to be aware of. So if we come back to this bait fishing outfit and you're wondering, will my reel be able to handle the kind of pressure I'm planning to put on it? What you need to do is look at the max drag rating and figure out about 70% of what it is. That's probably the max you want to use on it. So in this case, the max drag is 7 kilos. 70% of 7 kilos is about 4 to 5 kilos, which is what I'm planning to fish on this. So this works out well. You don't want to fish a reel to its maximum drag rating. I don't want to fish 7 kilos of drag on this reel. It's not how they're engineered. It's not how they're meant to be used. But if you use that mathematical rule, 70% of the reel's max drag rating is a good working drag to use on it, basically. So another important note here, and it's not a big deal, but it's something worth considering. When you've got a free spool or a spinning reel, I find that line gets pulled off more smoothly and consistently for a free spool reel. Okay, reason being, with spinning reels, there's an extra friction point for the line to travel over, and this can interfere with the drag consistently and smoothly releasing line. Now, the only caveat is with high-end spinning reels, their drags are high quality and they're consistent and they're smooth. And they should be, because you're paying a lot of money for them. So just one thing to consider, free spool versus fixed spool. Free spool reels will tend to release the line a bit more smoothly because the line comes directly off the spool, whereas with spinning reels you've got an extra friction point. Just something to remember and think about. When you're pushing your gear to the max, you really need a reel that will smoothly and consistently release line, because there'll be a very, very small margin of error. We're going to look at a real world example of me fighting a big fish. I like to use stickbait rods for rock fishing, and I'll have a reel with 2 spools. I'll have PE6 line there with braid for stickbaiting for kingfish, but then I'll also have a spare spool with 15 kilo monofilament line. And what I like to do then is swap it between the two. I can try and stickbait, or when it gets dark, I'll start fishing for snapper, big snapper. In this particular case, I hooked up to I think it was a stingray, could have been a shark, but I had to push the gear hard. Here I'm using a Shimano Osha bluefin tuna stickbait rod rated for PE 4 to 8 line. These rods are quite rare now. I started with 5 or 6 kilos of drag on the 15 kilo line. I figured out it wasn't a big snapper or kingfish after about 2 or 3 minutes into the fight, so I wanted to get it in fairly quickly. I tightened up the drag to a point where I was probably pushing 9 to 10 kilos of drag, and it brought the fish in quicker. It eventually cut the 60-pound leader with its teeth or on a rock close to the rocks. I didn't want to play it for 30 to 40 minutes, I just wanted to release it as soon as possible. It's probably a good thing that rays and sharks don't really do fast runs. They often just chug along with a lot of bulldog power, so you don't get big shocks coming through the line. So theoretically, I was using 15 kilo line, and according to the 30% rule, I should have been using 5 kilos of drag. But because I was using really good knots, a mini twist in my main line, and I had a rod that was rated to 12 kilos of drag, and I was using a good quality Shimano twin power reel, I could push it to double that rating. So I just want to show you one more thing here. This is an old rock fishing rod that I've used for quite a few years. I was fishing up in the far north and hooked a really big snapper. It just took off, was going for the rocks, and I had a Penn 545 reel. I tightened up the drag as much as I could, and it was still pulling line. I put my thumbs on the reel to exert more pressure. I burnt my thumbs. The rod bent over really, really hard, and the line started cutting grooves up the foam handle. So I had to put it all on the line to land this big snapper. I managed to turn its head, my knots held, and I landed a lovely 18-pound snapper. I thought it might have been my first 20-pounder, but it was just a little bit off. But it was a pretty epic fight, and I've still got scars on my rod to prove it. So one last tip here before I do a quick summary. Do a destruction test on your knot. What does that mean? Get a pair of scales, get fairly light line, maybe 6 kilo mono, and test your knots to destruction until they break, and then see how the scales measure up with the line rating. If your knots are like 5.5 kilos and 6 kilo line, then you're tying some good knots. If they're breaking about 3 or 4 kilos, then you need to practice your knots or try different knots. Lastly, a quick roundup. Learn how to tie 100% knots. Use a rod with a slightly higher rating. Use a reel that's got a good quality, consistent drag. Use that 70% rule to figure out how much drag you can use on it. Employ those fighting techniques that I was talking about. And lastly, a little saying here, you don't know how far you can push the envelope until you've pushed it too far. That's why you need to do the destruction test on your knots and find that out. So hopefully tight lines and big fish.